All right, so today we're going deep on something I know a lot of you are interested in, and frankly, something that's becoming more and more important in our world today.
Oh, yeah,
We're
absolutely.
talking about fraud analysis, and I know a lot of you out there are fascinated by this kind of stuff.
For sure.
Trying to understand, like, how do people actually go about doing this professionally? What does it really take to do this as a job?
Yeah. And it is a pretty wild world out there right now with scams and all sorts of stuff going on.
Totally.
Yeah,
So we're trying to give you kind of a shortcut to really understanding what it means to actually be a fraud analyst.
exactly. And we're going about this in kind of an interesting way because we're looking at it from the perspective of,
The interview.
yeah, what are the questions that they ask people who are trying to get these jobs?
Right. And it's amazing because when you look at the kind of stuff that they want to know about,
It tells you a lot.
it tells you so much about what's really important in the field and what the core skills are, what kind of experience you really need to have, and just how these folks really think about approaching this work.
Right. Like what makes them tick.
Exactly. So in our source material, what we're looking at today, there are a bunch of key areas that come up, and I think they're really revealing.
Oh, for sure.
So first off, they want to know about your practical background. Like, what have you actually done? How have you dealt with this stuff in the real world?
Right. Like show me what you got.
Exactly. And then they want to know how you stay up to date in a field that is like
Oh,
constantly
yeah. It's changing so fast.
right. Because the bad guys are always coming up with new ways to do their thing.
It's an arms race.
Right.
Totally.
So they also want to know about your ability to spot those hidden patterns. Like, how do you actually see the things that other people miss?
That's a big one.
And then, of course, the nitty-gritty of how you conduct investigations. Like, what are the steps you take? How do you approach it systematically?
All right. You got to have a process.
Then they want to know about how you decide which cases to prioritize, because you can't work on everything at once.
Especially when you have like limited time and resources.
For sure. And then they want to know about your adaptability. Like, what do you do when you encounter a situation that's totally out of the ordinary?
Right, like something you've never seen before.
Exactly. And then the big one, how do you make sure your analysis is rock solid, that it's accurate and trustworthy?
That's huge because if your analysis is flawed, the whole thing falls apart.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole thing about visualizing data, because you got to make it understandable for other people.
Yeah, otherwise it's just a bunch of numbers and who wants to look at that?
Right. And then how do you actually explain your findings to people who aren't data experts?
You got to be able to communicate it clearly to like non-technical folks.
And then finally, and this is so important, they want to know how you make sure you're following all the rules and regulations.
Compliance. Yeah, that's a big one.
It's huge. So the goal today is to give you a really solid understanding of what fraud analysis is all about, not just the methods, but also the mindset.
Yeah, like how do these professionals think? How do they approach these problems?
Exactly. We want to give you those like aha moments where things click and you really start to get it.
For sure.
All right, so let's dive in and start with something really basic experience, because one of the first things they ask in these interviews is about what you've actually done in the past.
Makes sense, right?
Totally, because they want to know, have you dealt with this stuff in the real world? Do you have a sense of how this actually works?
Yeah. It's not just theoretical.
Right, and what's interesting is they're not just looking for like a general description. They want concrete examples.
Oh, yeah. They want specifics like what were your responsibilities? What did you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
Exactly. So one of the things that comes up a lot in the source material is daily review of financial transactions. Like, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Right. You're looking for those red flags. Anything that seems out of place.
And it's not just about eyeballing it. It's about using data analysis tools to really dig in.
Oh, yeah. You got to leverage technology. It's essential.
So, for example, they might use these tools to filter transactions, look for spikes in activity, or identify patterns that just don't make sense.
Right. You're looking for anomalies, things that deviate from the norm.
And what's really cool is they don't just want to know what you did. They want to know what impact you had.
Oh, yeah. Like show me the results.
So they give this example of someone who reduced fraudulent activities by like 25% in just 6 months at a company called XYZ Inc.
Now, that's impressive. That's a measurable outcome.
Right. It shows you actually made a difference.
And it's not just about monitoring transactions. It's also about investigating those more complex cases.
Totally. So they have this other example about discovering vendor invoice irregularities at ABC Corp.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one.
So this wasn't just like a small thing. It involved digging deep, uncovering a pattern of overcharging, and then working with the legal team to actually recover the money.
Wow, and they actually got over $50,000 back.
That's huge. And they ended the contract with that vendor to prevent it from happening again.
Now, that's what I call a successful investigation.
Right. So it shows you're not just sitting there passively. You're actively looking for fraud and taking action to stop it.
You're a proactive fraud fighter.
Exactly. All right, so we've talked about experience, but here's the thing. Fraud doesn't stand still. It's constantly changing.
No, the bad guys are always coming up with new tricks.
So the next question is, how do you, as a fraud analyst, stay sharp? How do you keep up with all the latest techniques and tools?
That's so crucial because if you're not learning and adapting, you're going to get left behind.
It's like you're fighting a losing battle.
Exactly. And this is where continuous learning comes in.
Yeah.
It's absolutely essential in this field.
So our source material highlights a bunch of ways that analysts do this, and one of the big ones is attending industry events.
Oh, yeah, like conferences and workshops where you can hear from the experts and network with your peers.
Exactly. And they specifically mention the ACFE annual conference, which is the big one for certified fraud examiners.
Yeah, if you want to stay on top of your game, that's the place to be.
And it's not just about formal events either. They also talk about participating in online forums and communities.
Oh, yeah, like LinkedIn and Reddit, where people are sharing their experiences and discussing the latest trends.
And that's so valuable because you get real-time insights into what's happening right now in the field.
You're tapping into the collective knowledge of the community.
Exactly. And then, of course, there are the more formal learning resources like industry publications.
Yeah, things like Frog Magazine, where you can read about new research and case studies.
They give this really cool example about an article on machine learning for anomaly detection.
Oh, yeah, that's hot right now. Everyone's talking about AI and machine learning.
And the article talked about how this technology is actually being used to uncover fraud that traditional methods were missing.
That's amazing. Like, the machines are helping us catch the bad guys.
I know, it's kind of mind-blowing. And then, of course, there's formal training and certifications.
Yeah, you got to have those credentials.
Yeah. So they specifically mention the Certified Fraud Examiner course, which is like the gold standard in the field.
It's a rigorous program that really tests your knowledge and skills.
And then there are online courses like the one on advanced data analysis techniques from Coursera.
Oh, yeah. That one focuses on predictive modeling and time series analysis.
So it gives you the tools to analyze data over time and try to predict future trends, which is super important in fraud detection.
You're trying to anticipate what the bad guys are going to do next.
Exactly. So the takeaway here is that in this field, you can't just rest on your laurels. You got to constantly be learning and growing.
It's a lifelong journey.
All right, so we've talked about how fraud analysts stay up to date, but now let's get to the heart of it. How do they actually spot the fraud?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Right, because it's one thing to know about the latest techniques, but it's another thing to actually apply them in the real world and see those subtle clues that something's not right.
It's like a detective's intuition.
Totally. So our source material goes into some specific strategies that were used at XYZ Corporation to really improve their fraud detection rate.
All right, let's hear it.
So one of the key things was using data analytics tools like SAS and Excel, which are like the bread and butter of this field.
Yeah, they allow you to slice and dice the data and really dig into the details.
So you might use these tools to filter transactions, look for unusual spikes in activity, identify patterns that just don't fit.
You're looking for outliers, anything that deviates from the norm.
And they also talk about setting up fraud alerts within their detection software.
Oh, yeah, that's smart. You're basically creating triggers that will flag suspicious activity as it happens.
So instead of just passively looking at the data, you're proactively trying to catch fraud in real time.
We're setting traps for the bad guys.
I love it. And another important point is that fraud analysis isn't done in isolation.
Oh, yeah, you got to collaborate with other departments.
Totally. They specifically mention working with IT and customer service.
Yeah, because they often have different pieces of the puzzle.
Right. IT might have information about IP addresses and login attempts, while customer service might have reports of suspicious account activity.
So by sharing information, you can get a much more complete picture of what's going on.
And one thing I found really interesting is the emphasis on regularly reviewing procedures.
Oh, yeah, you got to constantly be looking for ways to improve your systems.
It's not just about reacting to fraud, it's about proactively trying to prevent it in the first place.
It's like a continuous improvement cycle.
Exactly. And they give this great example of an email phishing awareness campaign that they implemented.
Oh, yeah, those are so important because phishing is a huge problem these days.
Totally. And by educating their employees about the dangers of phishing, They were able to reduce related fraud by 25%.
Now, that's a significant impact.
Right, so it shows that by being proactive and constantly evaluating your procedures, you can really make a dent in fraud.
You're staying one step ahead of the bad guys.
So overall, they were able to increase their fraud identification rate by 40%, which is huge.
That's a game changer.
All right, so let's say you've identified a potential case of fraud. What happens next? What does an investigation actually look like?
Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty.
Our source material actually walks us through a recent investigation, which is super illuminating.
Well, lay it on me.
So this case involved stolen credit cards being used on a website, and the first red flag was a pattern of unusually high-value transactions happening within a short period.
So that's where the pattern recognition skills come in.
Exactly. They noticed something that just didn't seem right.
Got to trust your gut sometimes.
Totally.
Yeah.
So once they flagged the suspicious activity, they started digging deeper, analyzing the transaction logs.
So what were they looking for?
They were looking for commonalities between the transactions, like geographic location, IP addresses, anything that could connect the dots.
Try to find a pattern or a link.
Exactly. And then the key step was comparing those transactions with databases of known stolen credit cards.
Ah, so they were checking if those cards had been reported stolen.
Right. And sure enough, there were multiple matches.
Bingo, you got your confirmation.
So at that point, they knew they were dealing with real fraud, and they moved into a more active phase, contacting the affected customers.
Got to let them know what's going on.
Right. And they also worked with law enforcement to track down the perpetrators.
So this is where it gets serious.
Totally. Because fraud isn't just some victimless crime. It can have real consequences for individuals and businesses.
Absolutely.
The good news is they were able to recover over $100,000 and prevent any further activity.
Wow, so they saved the company a lot of money.
Right, and they also stopped the bad guys from victimizing anyone else.
It's a win-win.
So this example really shows how a fraud investigation unfolds step by step.
It's a fascinating process.
All right, so now let's imagine you're a fraud analyst and you've got a bunch of potential cases on your plate.
Oh boy, that's a lot to juggle.
How do you decide which ones to prioritize?
That's a great question because you can't work on everything at once.
Right, you got to be strategic about it, and our source material outlines a 3-step process for doing just that.
All right, let's break it down.
So the first step is assessing the potential impact of the fraud.
So you're basically asking, how much damage could this do?
Exactly. So a case involving a huge amount of money or affecting multiple departments is obviously going to be a higher priority.
Yeah, you got to focus on the big fish.
Then the second step is investigating the validity of the claims.
So you're making sure it's not just a false alarm.
Right. You're gathering data from transaction records, customer complaints, and other sources to see if there's real evidence to support the suspicion.
But you got to be thorough.
Absolutely. And then the third step is determining the likelihood of recovery.
So even if fraud did occur, is it realistic to expect that you can get the money back?
Sometimes it might be, but other times the chances might be slim.
So you got to weigh the costs and benefits.
And they give this great example of an employee embezzlement case at XYZ Corporation.
Oh boy, that's never good.
So they went through this prioritization process and decided to focus on this case because it had a significant impact and there was a good chance of recovering the funds.
And what happened?
Well, they were able to recover $100,000, and they also implemented new preventative measures to stop it from happening again.
So they learned from the experience and made their system stronger.
Exactly. Now, what happens when you encounter a fraud scenario that's totally unique, something you've never seen before?
Oh, that's a good one. You got to be adaptable.
Our source material talks about dealing with the unexpected, and they give this example of a customer trying to use a stolen credit card, but they're also trying to cover their tracks.
Sneaky.
I know. So they were using a different IP address and multiple delivery addresses.
Trying to throw off the investigators.
So the fraud analysts had to think outside the box, and they ended up using their fraud detection software to spot the inconsistencies, and then they set up a system to monitor any future purchases linked to that stolen card.
So they were watching for any further signs of suspicious activity.
And it worked. They were able to catch the perpetrator, recover the funds, and prevent any future fraud.
That's impressive.
They saved the company something like $50,000 by being proactive.
So you got to be ready for anything in this field.
Absolutely. All right, so all this analysis is great, but it's only valuable if it's accurate and trustworthy.
Oh, yeah. You got to make sure your findings are rock solid.
So how do fraud analysts ensure that their results are reliable?
Well, it all comes down to being very meticulous and systematic.
Our source material outlines several key steps, and the first one is making sure the data you're using is reliable.
Garbage in, garbage out, right?
Exactly. So they talk about cross-checking data, using sampling techniques, and even bringing in new sources of information to get a more complete picture.
You got to make sure your data is clean and accurate.
And then they talk about using different statistical techniques to reduce errors and make sure the analysis is sound.
So things like regression analysis and outlier detection.
Exactly. These techniques help you identify patterns and anomalies that might not be immediately obvious.
It's like using a magnifying glass to see the finer details.
I love that analogy. And another really important point is transparency.
Oh yeah, you got to be open about your methods.
So they talk about using open source tools, sharing code, and documenting the entire process.
This allows others to examine your work and verify your findings.
And it builds trust in the results because anyone can see how you arrived at your conclusions.
It's like peer review for fraud analysis.
And finally, they talk about comparing the analysis results with real-world examples.
So you're basically checking your findings against known cases of fraud.
Exactly, to make sure that your analysis is aligned with what actually happens in the real world.
It's like a reality check.
So by following these steps, fraud analysts can ensure that their work is accurate, reliable, and trustworthy.
It's all about maintaining integrity.
Now, we've talked a lot about data, but sometimes data can be overwhelming, just a bunch of numbers and spreadsheets.
Oh yeah, it can be hard to make sense of it all.
So that's where data visualization comes in.
You got to make the data sing.
Exactly. And our source material talks about how these tools are being used in fraud analysis to make the data more understandable and actionable.
So what kind of tools are we talking about?
Well, they specifically mention Tableau and Power BI.
Oh yeah, those are the big ones.
They're super powerful tools that allow you to create charts, graphs, dashboards, and other visualizations that really bring the data to life.
You can see patterns and trends that you might have missed just by looking at raw numbers.
Exactly. And they give this great example of using Tableau to create an interactive dashboard that helped identify a sudden increase in credit card purchases from a single IP address.
So they were able to see the anomaly visually.
And it turned out to be a fraudulent scheme that they were able to shut down.
Nice catch.
Right. And then they talk about using Power BI to create a risk assessment model.
So they were basically assigning fraud scores to transactions based on various factors.
Exactly, like IP address, location amount, and other variables.
And this allowed them to prioritize their reviews, focusing on the highest risk transactions first.
Which is so much more efficient than just randomly checking transactions.
It's like a targeted approach.
And they were able to reduce their overall losses by 20% in just 6 months.
Wow, that's impressive.
All right, so you've done all this complex analysis, you've got these beautiful visualizations, but now you need to explain it to someone who doesn't understand all the technical details.
Yeah, that can be a challenge.
Like, how do you talk to your boss or the board of directors about this stuff?
You got to make it simple and understandable.
Exactly. And our source material talks about the importance of effective communication with non-technical stakeholders.
All right, so what are the key strategies?
Well, first off, you got to ditch the jargon and use plain language.
No more technical mumbo-jumbo.
And instead of just showing them a bunch of numbers, use visual aids like charts and graphs.
Pictures are worth 1,000 words.
And you also got to provide context about explain what the fraud is and how it affects the company.
Give them the big picture.
And most importantly, give them actionable recommendations for how to prevent it from happening again.
You got to give them something they can actually do.
They give this great example of a presentation to the board of directors where they used infographics, simple language, and practical examples to explain their findings.
So they tailored their message to the audience.
And the board was able to understand the issue quickly and make informed decisions.
That's the power of effective communication.
All right, finally, no discussion of fraud analysis would be complete without talking about compliance.
Oh, yeah. You got to follow the rules.
It's not just about being ethical, it's also about avoiding legal problems.
Absolutely.
So our source material outlines several key actions that fraud analysts need to take to ensure compliance.
Let's hear it.
First and foremost, you got to familiarize yourself with the relevant regulations and legislation.
You got to know the law.
And then you got to keep accurate, complete, and properly stored documentation of everything.
So notes, reports, evidence, the whole 9 yards.
It's all about creating a clear audit trail.
And you also got to submit reports and filings to regulatory agencies on time.
Don't miss those deadlines.
And if you're ever unsure about something, consult with legal counsel. It's better to be safe than sorry.
They give this great example of a team that uncovered over $1 million in fraudulent activity.
Wow, that's a big one.
And they did it all while strictly adhering to all the regulations.
So they prove that you can be both effective and compliant.
Exactly. Compliance isn't a barrier to success. It's a framework for doing things the right way.
All right, so to wrap it all up, we've seen that being a fraud analyst is so much more than just working with numbers.
It's a multifaceted field that requires a unique blend of skills.
You got to be analytical, curious, adaptable, and a great communicator.
You got to be able to see the patterns, understand the motivations, and ultimately prevent future harm.
It's a challenging but rewarding profession.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener, hopefully this deep dive has given you a much better understanding of what fraud analysis is all about.
We've gone beyond the textbook definitions and given you a glimpse into the real world of fraud investigation.
We've explored the key principles, the essential skills, and the mindset of a successful fraud analyst.
And hopefully we've sparked your curiosity.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. As technology continues to advance, fraudulent activities are becoming more sophisticated.
The bad guys are always up in their game.
What role do you think emerging technologies like artificial intelligence will play in the future of fraud analysis?
Will it be a tool for good or a weapon for evil?
How will it impact both the perpetrators and the protectors?
It's a fascinating question with no easy answers.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, stay vigilant.